David was a boy, a shepherd boy. He was the youngest of 7 brothers.
Ouch, that hurts.
They were all mighty warriors. But one day, a giant named Goliath came along. Everyone was afraid of him. Except David.
I'm not afraid.
I will break you.
We started last week with this is a 2-week series. Next week we're going to have Graduate Sunday, and so we have college graduates and we have high school graduates, and we're excited about all of them. This week we're talking about part 2 of our series on spiritual perspective, and just did that real quick video to get you familiar with a story that everybody knows. Even if you don't go to church, pretty much everybody knows. In fact, a lot of people don't know that it's a Bible story. They think it's like a metaphor. It's a real story that happened. David, a young shepherd boy, fought a giant named Goliath who was 9 foot, and we learned last week, 9 foot 9 inches tall, which is huge. We're not going to deal with the battle, but we're dealing with the perspective leading to the battle, which is something important. And last week, if you weren't here last week, it's okay, because each week's a different thing, but let me help you out with this. Last week, we left David at the scene, at the battle scene. He had come up with questions, and these questions were so important in the lives of the people around him. But what we see is David had walked onto the field of battle concerned about something that was of no concern to the soldiers, to the armies of Israel. And that's the problem we have, just to get you up to speed where we're at. See, to David's concern was for the glory of God. And like most of us, we think we're concerned about the glory of God, but David found out that the people of God were always concerned about the glory of God. See, for David, more was at stake than the fate of Israel when he walked onto that field. More was at stake to him than simply the fact that maybe Israel was going to look bad in a defeat. That there was more at stake than the humbling of Israel's pride because they faced this huge giant, 9 foot 9, which is his mass. And the problem that David understood, and what we talked about last week, was the fact that the armies of God, the armies of Israel, saw their king. He was sidelined by fear. And fear can do that to us. And fear is just as much a giant as Goliath is. Sometimes it's even greater in that respect. And although they had taken their place in the formations, and that's what we noticed last week, they had all gotten properly ready for battle. They had shouted, and they did this for almost 6 weeks, 40 days is what the Bible tells us. They had marched out, they had shined and polished, and they stood there chanting their threats and all kinds of war chants across the valley of Elah to the Philistines, who did the same thing, with one exception. Morning and evening walked out this 9 foot 9 tall giant, and he came out every morning and issued a challenge, a simple challenge, to send out a champion to fight him. And then he ended up that with a blasphemous defiance of God. And he defied God not 1 day, not 2 days, but for nearly 6 weeks this has gone on. And we saw that the repercussion of this was the people of God, when they heard this blasphemy, they didn't get upset about it, they got afraid of it. And I told you last week, that's pretty much the status of Christianity in the 21st century. We get in our positions week after week. Hey buddy, we show up for church. We carry our Bibles, we even dress up sometimes and look really sharp. We sing words that we don't really mean. I surrender all, and yet we don't, because we aren't giving up certain things to God. Yeah, this is the hard part. And yet we say that, which brings me to the thought, what I want to understand today, because what David noticed was their perspective was all wrong, and their behavior showed that they didn't believe their beliefs. And the question I would ask you today, the question we want to deal with today, and the question that's so important for us, and this is where we come in today, ask yourself this: do I believe my beliefs? Do I believe my beliefs? You know why? For some of us, why we're having a hard time? Because we've grown up in a country that had on their money, one nation under God. In God we trust. Do you believe that though? Because when it comes down to it, we say, in God we trust, but really it's in the president, in Congress. And we fear every time the guy we don't want is in office. That's the sad truth. And we don't really do that. In fact, I came across this, and I'm going to try and read this as briefly as possible. The Barna Research Group, who does polling and all kinds of different things, political, religious, you name it, they published an article several years ago, that was entitled "The State of Churched Christians." So he's done a survey of what people who go to church all the time believe or say they believe. In this study, he asked several questions, and this is what he had. 15 things I want to give you real quick. Number one, he said, church-going Christians stated that worship services are generally the only time that they worship God. Listen carefully to what I'm reading on these. He said, number two, 8 out of every 10 Christ followers, that is church people who go to church every week, 8 out of 10, that's 80% of believers do not feel that they have ever entered into the presence of God or experienced a connection with Him during a worship service. Half, 50% of all believers say that they do not feel that they have experienced a genuine connection with God in the past year. 1 out of every 4 church believers says that when they worship God, they expect to be the primary beneficiary of the worship. Most church-going Christians say that they expect to get the most from the worship experience. It's consumer mentality, if you didn't know that. Number 5, the typical church believer will die without leading a single person to a life-saving knowledge of and a relationship with Jesus Christ. You want to know why Christianity is dying? It's not because of the Savior. It's because of us. That's the truth. Number 6, a majority of believers do not have a specific person in mind for whom they're praying for and hope that that person will get saved. Number 7, most church Christians believe that since they are not gifted in evangelism, it's not their responsibility. Number 8, only 9% of all born-again adults have a biblical worldview, meaning that less than 1 out of every 10 Christians aged 18 or older believes that absolute moral truth is contained in the Bible and possess a handful of core beliefs that reflect such truth. This includes things like the Bible is accurate in all its teachings. You're talking 9%. Only 9% of all church-going, not non-church-going, church-going every week. The Bible is accurate in all its teachings. Jesus lived a sinless life on earth. Satan is real and not symbolic. All believers are responsible for sharing their faith in Christ with others. The only means of salvation is through God's grace. And God is the all-knowing and all-powerful creator of the universe who still rules it today. Number 9, according to the typical believer, they contend that the Bible is accurate in what it teaches, but when polled, the average church-going adult spends less time reading the Bible in a year than watching TV, listening to music, and definitely being online and social media. Number 10, when given the opportunity to state how they want to be known by others, fewer than 1 out of every 10 Christ followers mention a description that reflected a relationship with God. Number 11, in a typical week, only 1 out of every 4 believers will allocate some time to serving someone other than themselves. Number 12, the typical believer would rather give money to an organization to allow it to do good deeds in society than personally assisting in the alleviating of the needs of disadvantaged people. Number 13, fewer than 1 out of every 6 church believers has a relationship with another believer through which they are spiritually accountable. Number 14, the most significant influence on the choices of church believers is neither teaching from the pulpit nor advice from fellow congregants, that's you guys. It's through messages absorbed through media, through influencers, and last of all, through family members. And number 15, the typical Christian family spends less than 3 hours per month in endeavors designed to jointly develop or apply their faith. Now, I read that not so to shame anybody, because we'd all be shamed here. I will say if the truth hurts, then maybe you ought to go to the doctor. That's not me. That's Jesus. But what I'm saying is, we are just like the army of Israel, where we say, you're the almighty, everlasting God, but when it comes down to our problems, when it comes down to our day-to-day routines, it doesn't reflect it. And that's why the giants of life defeat us. They cause us to step back in fear. They cause us to shake and quake and tremble because they look so much bigger than the God that we've made so small. And that's the point. The spiritual journey, learning about doubting our doubts and believing our beliefs, will mean the difference between us and progressing or failing in the Christian life. And that's the truth here. So the question I want you to consider as we're talking about this today is, do you believe your beliefs? Is what you say really matter? Because to the world, they don't believe that to be true. And that's the problem we have. See, the army of Israel, they believed in a God that they called Jehovah or Yahweh. And they said all these different beliefs all the time, but did they really believe them? Such as this. They believed that Yahweh is the living God. Jehovah is the living God, but they acted as if he was dead. They believed that he was the Lord Almighty, but they acted as if he was powerless. They believed that he was faithful, covenant-keeping God, but they acted as if he was indifferent to their trouble. They believed that Jehovah was the deliverer, but they acted to suggest that they did not expect him to deliver them. And their behavior, and this is where the rub comes down, their behavior made it clear that they did not believe their beliefs. That's the problem. So, having lost sight in God, no wonder they didn't engage in battle. Do you get what I'm saying now? Want to know why Christians don't witness? I don't feel comfortable. No, the truth is you've lost sight of God. See, when we lose sight of God, according to what we see in this story of the Israelites, for 40 days, 6 weeks, it wasn't a one-time experience that Goliath came out. He came out twice a day for 40 days, 6 weeks, and he defied the armies of the living God. A God that had done miraculous things for Israel since the time they became a nation of Israel, the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He had delivered them through miraculous things, and now they stand on this battlefield, and really they face this small task of defeating a small army, a small man who's 9'9", but he is small compared to a God who's done so many amazing things. And yet, they didn't believe that they would win. And so every time he stood on the field and he shouted to them, you know what they did? They stepped back in fear. Every time the blasphemies came about God, they shook in disbelief that there was a God. And their beliefs didn't match their behavior. And that's the problem we find. See, when we lose sight of God, inevitably we lose our faith and we lose the heart for battle. And that's what we find as the setting for where we pick up today. When we do this, we begin to start looking at things through human perspective. And you may have the best analytics in the world as a human. You may be a troubleshooter extraordinaire. But if you try and take your problems and fix them yourself, you will always fail. You will always be less, because God is ultimately who we're supposed to turn our heart to, our minds to. Because God always positioned us in a place that we will lose. That's the idea. See, it's the power of us being less than. That's what he's trying to prove here. Why did God take a shepherd boy of all things, a young teenage boy? Why wouldn't God look for his own giant? Because God doesn't need giants to win the battles. Amen. He doesn't. God's big enough to beat a giant without a giant. And that's the things you have to understand in your life. God doesn't need experts. God, and that's exactly what Paul tells us in the New Testament. He says God didn't choose the wise. He didn't choose the mighty. He didn't choose the great. He chose the weak. Because when I'm weak, then I'm strong, is what Paul would tell us. Because that's how God works. But he needs to know, do you believe what you say you believe? That's the question. See, their predicament, the army of Israel, came from a very skewed perspective. They were prepared to take their places on the battlefield. They were even dressed up like soldiers. Sounds like church once again, right? Yet there's nobody fighting. And that's where I find church today, right? Sing songs, read Bible verses, let's have Bible studies, but nobody's doing the work of God. Right? It's all quiet out there. Come on. Help me out here. That's the point. See, we're cowering sometimes in response to Islam. We're cowering in response to government. We're cowering in response to all these different people, the atheists, the agnostics. And I want you to know right now, we have a God who wins. We don't have to cower. Amen. That's what Israel knew, or should have known. But do you believe your beliefs? That's the difference here. So we pick up in verse 24 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. Verse 24, it says this. Whenever the Israelites, and this is the problem once again, whenever the Israelites saw the man. Now, when I say the man, that man, he's huge, right? He's 9'9". He's wearing armor that weighs about 125 pounds. That's a huge guy that can do that. And he's ready to take on all contenders. And so, whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Not just a little fear. Not just, oh, I'm scared a little bit. No, it's one of those fears like, man, I don't want to be around this. And that's the situation that we studied last week and we took up on. And they were running in response to this challenge of the Philistine. And what we pick up today, and we're not going to have quite as many verses to talk about today, because what I want to do today is I want to focus on two conversations, two dialogues that happen that are so important in perspective to us. And they both feature David. David comes on the scene, this young man, and remember last week he had some questions asked. Here he is, he's been discussing, he's asked these questions, and I would encourage you, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back into 1 Samuel 17 and read some of these verses up to verse 28. But in verse 28, we find he's come into this place where he's asked these questions, and now in verse 28, the Bible says that when Eliab, now that's David's oldest brother, he's got 7 other brothers, David's the youngest, sometimes he wasn't even invited to dinner. That's how bad it was for David. Okay, he was in sad shape. They left him out in the field and didn't feed him, and he was just okay with that. But Eliab's always been in charge. He's big, he's strong, he's tall. He's what everybody thought of as the leader. So Eliab hears David ask those questions we discussed last week. David's oldest brother heard him speaking with men. He burned with anger. What could he possibly be upset about? That's the question. What was he upset about? David is asking, why is no one taking care of this giant? Why is everybody backing up with fear? What should happen if someone did win against this giant? And those are the questions that we discussed last week. But Eliab hears this, and what we find is this arguing amongst the people now. In the ranks of the army of God, they're arguing. And he burns with anger at him, and it keeps going. It says, and asked, and this is important, some of the things he's going to ask here. He says, why have you come down here? Now, it's obvious if you paid attention last week, and for those of you who may not have been here, I want to catch you up. Dad sent him. That's the question. That's the answer to that one. Dad said, David, go check on your brothers, take some food to them, go check on them, because it's been 40 days, it's been 6 weeks. I want to know, are they winning? Are they dead? Or what's going on? Bring me some news. So that was David's purpose. And probably Eliab knew, but he's saying a question here that's not really, he doesn't really want an answer. He wants to put David down. So notice he says, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep? And that's like, when I read that, I was thinking like, that's sort of mean, because it's not a slam on David, it's a slam on his whole family. Like, yeah, we're so poor we only have a couple of sheep, you know? We're not like J.A. driving a bunch of sheep around. We got a couple of sheep. No, I'm just kidding. Who did you leave those few sheep? And what he's doing, he's minimizing David's task. David, you don't do much around home. You're just a little kid who only watches, and he makes you think like, David's got 2 sheep, and that's all he can do, and that's the best he can do. When David probably had a whole flock that he was taking care of, but he did a good job. He's known as the shepherd of Israel. And that was one of the titles that David carried. He says, who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness, thinking like David snuck off just to see? He's saying, David, you just came to see the show. You just came for entertainment purposes, that's it. And then he goes on, same verse. He says, I know And that's important. This part is so important to seeing what's happening here. He says, I know how conceited you are. Doesn't this sound like brotherly talk? Now, if you didn't have a brother, or you had a nice brother, maybe that's not an issue, but this is how it would have been. I had 2 brothers and a sister, man, and then I had 2 sons that they're still like that today even. They're just always at each other. They've got to make a comment. And this is just brotherly talk here. I know how conceited you are. And how wicked your heart is. Really, you do? That's funny. Because it didn't sound like he was that wicked to me when he asked those questions. In fact, he was looking on God's behalf. That's what we noticed last week. He says, you came down only to watch the battle. To which David should have said, yeah, but it's not very entertaining because no one is fighting. What kind of battle is this? I mean, think about it. If David came down to watch a battle, boy, he sort of bought a bad ticket, didn't he? There's nothing going on. In fact, Eliab, you shouldn't be talking to me. You should be out fighting, shouldn't you? And that's sort of the idea behind this whole thing. And they begin to argue, and they're acting poorly. The soldiers, that is Eliab and his brothers, are acting poorly. Why? Because they're thinking incorrectly. They're thinking wrongly. Because it's all in their minds what the problem is. Fears grip their minds, and it's all about the way that we think. That's why Paul, over in the New Testament, he urges us in Romans chapter 12, verse number 2, don't conform to the pattern of the world. And notice what he says, and I'm sure you've heard this verse before, and I'm not going to preach a message on this, but he says, but be transformed. This in the Greek, the word is metamorphosis. Change your mind. Don't be pressed into the mold, but be changed by the renewing of your mind. And notice how important he puts that in the emphasis there in Romans chapter 12. See, our thoughts control our behaviors, and we've talked about this before. They control our actions, and so if no one's battling, there's a problem in your mind. If no one's fighting, there's a problem in the mind. If no one's doing what they're supposed to do as a soldier, the fears grip their mind. It's not an action ability. It's not because they couldn't walk. They didn't have. I don't think they were wearing boots on. I think they all had swords. They all had shields. They just didn't have a mind to go out and get it done. And that's the problem. And see, when the people of God begin to think incorrectly, they begin to act poorly. And the first thing we need, and this is what you're going to see, the first thing that we need is the last thing that we want. Which brings us to which brings us into this conversation that we've already read a little bit about, the conversation between Eliab and David. And that's the first half of this. Instead of Eliab looking over at David and saying, hey, David, thanks for bringing the food because we were really hungry. And thanks for coming in and checking on us that you're concerned and Dad's concerned. I want to put everything at rest. And instead of coming and thanking David or thinking good of him, welcoming him, and admitting maybe that David's questions were right. Why is no one doing anything about this giant? Eliab goes on the attack here. What he needed most, what Eliab needed most, and what we needed most, and what we don't like the most, is correction. Right? Oh, nobody likes that. It's not easy when we're getting correction. And see, David, the youngest brother, brings the correction of God, and that's even harder. I think having 2 older brothers, man, they hated when I was right. They hated when I was right, and that's the issue. And the thing that Eliab needed the most, the thing that the armies of Israel needed the most, was the thing that they wanted the least. See, Eliab, like most of us, he wanted to feel good about himself. If you came to church today thinking, hey, I want to come to make myself feel good, you picked the wrong church. Sorry. You picked the wrong Bible. Because I'm just telling you right now, when I read God's word, it never makes me the center of importance. It makes God the center of importance. Amen. Now, there are people who read it wrong and come out with this whole, like, it's all about me, my happiness, my... No, it's not. It's about God's glory. Remember, that was the issue. That's the issue that they're struggling with. And see, Eliab thought it's all about him. Eliab wanted to feel good about himself. He wanted to affirm that he was feeling, what he was feeling was right, and he was fulfilling all the obligations of being a soldier. And if I'm sitting back thinking, like, do we rate Eliab's performance on the battlefield? Can you rate his performance on the battlefield? He hasn't even fought. What do if you're David, remember David was given an assignment, go check on your brothers. What do you come back and tell Dad? Dad, they're fine because they haven't even done anything. To To which I think his dad would be well, why did they even go join the army then? They're not doing what they're supposed to do. A soldier that doesn't fight is not a soldier then, is it? And that's the idea here. But I think what the problem was is every time Goliath came out, and every time Goliath said, I defy the armies of Saul, the armies of Israel, I defy the living God. Every time he did that, Goliath knew deep down inside that there's not a man among us prepared for this challenge. That's what he called. There's not somebody that's gifted enough to do this. And the answer to the taunts of Goliath are met, and this is really irksome, they're met by God in the response of a little shepherd boy. Of all people. God, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear my kid brother telling me I'm not doing my job. I don't want him telling me about how I've lost perspective and I'm not honoring God. I don't want to hear it. And what Eliab needs is not what he wants. And that's true with us. What we need, but see, so often we open up God's Word and go, man, I just need to feel good about me. And God says, no, you don't. You need to feel good about me. And that's where we miss our perspective because we're looking around us for who can be the best, who can be the, and we want to be so superiorly gifted. And God says, I don't need gifted people. I need little shepherd boys who have no ability because I'm going to work a miracle not through your greatness, but through your inadequacies. That's the point. David as the shepherd boy wasn't, and I know we make him into a hero. We make him into an expert sling guy. I don't know if he was or not. I mean, maybe he was. We make him into some kind of skilled person with a sword and all that. He didn't even have a sword when he goes and kills Goliath, by the way. He has to take the guy on the ground sword from him and cut off his head. That's what's crazy about this whole situation. And once again, what Eliab needed was not what he wanted, and that's how it is. Instead of and the problem we see here, instead of admitting what he really needed, Eliab does what we do. We burn with anger and go on the attack. That's what it says here in verse 28 there. He burned with anger and he went on attack. See, when we're confronted with our wrong thinking, we get a little defensive, don't we? When we are acting poorly and our thinking's wrong, what do? We get angry and we attack back. And that's exactly what Eliab does here. And David says, what are you attacking me for? See, he talks to his brother. And there's jealousy here because David's faith confronts Eliab's failures. And that's what we don't like. We don't like that. David's faith, and so right away, like, David, you're a little conceited, little no good brat who's probably left the work at home wrong. Do you get what he's saying now? Hey, David! And David's like, bro, back off. I didn't do anything. I'm here because Dad sent me. And I've got the right perspective. Now, he didn't really say all those things because he should have. Eliab wouldn't have listened, though, because he had anger in his heart. And David's questions makes their inactivity more glaring. And notice Eliab's response, that once again, he burned with anger at him, specifically directed at David. See, it infuriated him to hear what his younger brother was actually saying. Eliab had a hard time believing that David had actually approached things properly. Because if he acknowledges that David's doing something right, then he has to acknowledge that he's thinking poorly and he's behaving incorrectly. So instead of responding to the challenge and the opportunity that's presented by David, who's going to go out there and take on this giant, instead of acknowledging that it highlights my need to change, God goes on the attack. And he questions the motives of David, and he argues against David's actions. And this is always the case when we start thinking in a self-centered way. And that's exactly what Eliab's doing. He's not thinking God's way. He's taken man's approach. He's reasoned out. He's got everything set. And Eliab is jealous for himself. While David in his actions, is jealous for God and God's glory. In fact, go back to verse 26, the second half of verse 26. Remember what David ended up This is the questions we looked at last week. In the second half of verse 26, the question David had was, who is this uncircumcised? This non-covenant guy from God, of the Philistines, that he's not in the covenant of God. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David's question is like, it's not about David. He's focused on God. David believed that there is no reason why Goliath should be allowed to defy God and blaspheme God for 40 days. 40 days, twice a day. But instead of acknowledging that David was right, Goliath gets angry. We already said that. And what does he do? He degrades David's position. Notice the end of verse 28. He says, I know how conceited you are. He's degrading David. He's putting him down. And how wicked your heart is. Come on. Is he really that wicked? I mean, he may be silly. He may be foolish. Because foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, and that's about verse 2. But conceited and wicked? Come on. He's got God's interest in mind. We know that's not right. And that's the problem. See, when our hearts are wicked, we act in such a way that suggests that we know what's in somebody else's heart. Picture that. He's saying, I know it's in you. I know what you got in you. I know who you are. You can't pretend to be something else. And not only does he do that, notice that last phrase. You came down only to watch the battle. And you know what he's doing? When you get to that position where you're attacking, the next thing you do is you start accusing people of your own problems. You came down only to watch the battle. Who was really just watching the battle? The soldiers were. They're in activity. And here's what he's trying to say. He's saying, hey, you just came to see the circus. And David's saying, no, I didn't, because there's not a circus going on other than you guys. There's nothing happening. There's nobody doing anything. You're all watching. And so how can you accuse me of being the watcher when you're really the watcher? But that's what we do, and that's the human response when we take it down to the human level. And David responds, I love this, David responds to this as in a fashion that only a sibling, a brother, could do. And look what he says, verse 29, this is what he says. Now what have I done? Can you picture that? I mean, what did I do? I don't know if you've ever had kids or you've said this yourself, but what did I do? Said David. And then he says, can't I even speak? Come on, give me a chance to defend myself. That's his normal teenager sibling speak there. Come on, back off, dude. I don't know how you get a picture how it would be said in your language in your home, but that's how it went. And he says, hey, you know what? It isn't reasonable that I should ask about taking up isn't it reasonable I should be asking about taking up the challenge for God's glory? That's what he's really saying there. Isn't it reasonable what I'm asking? What did I do? I'm looking out for God's best interests. And his confident reliance on God, as he says this, piques the interest of all those around, not just Eliab. And we find that verse 31 tells us someone else was listening. It says what David said was overheard and reported to Saul. Uh-oh. Shepherd boy's going to have to go to the king. Going to the principal's office, right? That's how it works. Saul sent for him. And you're wondering, it's almost there's another tension spot in this story that's going on. You're like, uh-oh, did David overstep his boundaries? Is he saying too much? Because now the king wants him. And remember, if you didn't know, Saul is Saul is exactly what we want for a principal or a king or whatever, because he's tall, big, and mean looking, right? The Bible says he's head and shoulders above all the other people in Israel, not Goliath, but Israel. And so, it's you're going to the principal's office kind of thing going on, and that's what David goes off to. But David's not concerned about this because he didn't do anything wrong. He's following God's glory, and that's what he wants to do. Which brings us to the second dialogue, which is a weird dialogue because brother to brother, we're sort of like, okay, got that. But now all of a sudden, the shepherd boy is standing before the king. And they're going to have this issue here. And oddly enough, in verse 32 here, notice it says, David said to Saul, you get called into the principal's office, usually to sit down and be quiet until the principal starts talking, right? Okay, I can see that you guys haven't been to the principal's office. But let me just reassure you, when you get called to the principal's office, you let the principal start talking first. And I say that not because I got called a principal. I was a principal, so some of you are like, oh, he's a bad kid. No, I wasn't. I was actually a good kid. David gets called in to see Saul, and David just says, well, I got this opportunity. Let me share some wisdom with you here. And so David, can you imagine this teenage boy? He's not old enough to fight in the army. We already understood that. He walks into Saul, being called in front of the king. Everybody else is scared to death. He walks in and says, hey, let no one lose heart. Everybody calm down. That's how I'd say it. Calm down. My wife hates it when I say that. Now calm down, Sheila. She's like, I've realized, one of those things I've realized in life is when I say that, she's not going to get calm. So just so you guys don't follow my advice on that one. Don't use that, okay? Stay away from it. But he says, calm down, king. Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. And he's pointing out, he's not talking about all the situations of life. He's just talking about one. Because that's what he's there to address. He says, don't let a 9'9" giant get you upset. Don't let the circumstances that you find yourself for 40 days waking up every day, hearing blasphemy, going to bed at night, hearing that blasphemy. Don't let it scare you, because your servant will go and fight it. Nobody else is laughing. You've read the story, that's why. If you hadn't read the story, you would be like, what? You're either like, this is the most insane, stupid thing ever said, or you'd be laughing at him. Because he's a little boy. Little boy wasn't able to go to battle. In fact, I'll skip ahead a little bit, and I'm not really going to skip ahead because we're not going to even read this part, but when Saul actually gives him his armor to wear to go out and face the giant, it didn't fit. His armor didn't fit David. So that's how small of a guy this is. He's a teenager. He's not even a big, strapping, big, huge teenager. He's just an average to small. That's what I'd say. And so David comes out, but I want you to know, when you read that, if you were to read that verse and that verse alone, verse 32, if you were to read that verse and think to yourself, David has got a big, brave outlook on life, you would be wrong. Because that is not at all, and I'll explain in just a minute, that's not at all what David's going to say. He's just saying, hey, I've got the solution to your problem. And since you guys are too scared to see God, let me share with you my perspective. To which Saul replies in the next verse. Saul replies in verse 33, you are not able. Cold water just got poured on David. Good job, David. David says, don't fear. All your fears, all your worries will go away. Think about your biggest struggle right now in your life. If someone would walk up to you and say, don't worry about it, I got this, I'm going to take care of everything. I don't care what it is. You'd feel relieved, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you? But not Saul, because Saul looks at David and says, you can't do this. And Saul's the voice of reason here. He says, you're not able to go out and fight against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and that term there, it really would be better. You're only a young boy. Now, he's not making him, boy in the Hebrew would be young, like a toddler, like Asher's age. We're talking about, he's saying, hey, you're just really just out of elementary school. You can't fight this guy. And he's been a mature, seasoned warrior from the time of that. He's killed men at your age and beyond. You have no experience. And when we listen to it, we're like, Saul is so wise, isn't he? Boy, Saul was a troubleshooter, wasn't he? He was so wise. Because Saul was reasoned, Saul was sensible, Saul was pragmatic, and Saul was wrong. Wrong. See, the problem with Saul is he had a time ago had quit listening to the voice of God. He had lost the confidence of God, and he had lost confidence in God. And he speaks the voice of reason, human reason, the voice of sensibility. He speaks in a very ordered way, in a very understandable way. He speaks in a man-centered way. And Saul, just like his soldiers, had lost the theological perspective on the battlefield. And so God is absent from the mind of Saul and doesn't see David as a possibility to the answer of the problem. But David isn't finished. That's what's great about this. David's not finished. Where Moses would have stopped and said, okay, the king said no, so I'm just going to walk out of here. David, once again, showing a lot of, it's not I'm confident in myself, but David knows what God's plan is for his life because he's got godly perspective. David said to Saul, your servant has been, and he's giving us this lesson in verses 34 through 36. He says, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. Good for you. No, he's telling us, and what he's doing, he's opening the door on some history that's going to enlighten us on the whole issue here. So notice what he says here, and this is so important. He says, when a lion or a bear, now, not imaginary. Okay, he's not talking about, I have this imaginary lion friend and this imaginary bear friend. He's not even talking about the lion from the Wizard of Oz. He's talking about real lion, real bear. He says when, and not if, but when a lion or bear came, and that speaks to, it did happen multiple times. Now, I don't know about you. I have not come real close face to face with a bear, but I have with a lion. In fact, not just one. I've come across a lot. We can talk about this some other time. I'll just tell you this much. Any guy who says they can handle a lion is a liar. I'm serious. Those things out in the wild scare, I'm telling you, they scare me. They are just massive. I watched a lion jump on the back of a zebra one time and took that zebra down. Just your heart starts pumping, and I mean, this is a little ways off from us, but man. So when David says, hey, a lion or a bear came and carried off sheep by flock, you're thinking, oh, well, it's too bad for that sheep. I guess it's lamb chops for dinner or something, you know? And David says, no. Verse 35, he goes on, he says, I went after it. And you're thinking, once again, put this in perspective, not a big, huge warrior. This is little old David who wasn't even able to fight in the army. David went after a lion. David went after a bear. And really, in his account, he almost makes it sound like it happened multiple times. It happened often. He says, I went after it, not just to view it, but he said, I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. That's very distinctive. So let's put some reason here. I think you guys are smart enough to help me with this one. If he's rescuing the sheep from its mouth, he had to do what? Open the mouth. There we go. I'm not touching the mouth of a bear or a lion. I'm just telling you right now. You can. Even if they were, I'm telling you, even if I was down at the zoo and they had tranquilized those bad boys and they were sleeping hard, I've seen enough bad Hollywood movies to know that the fake shark sleeping and all the rest of those, they always wake up. I'm not doing it. I'm standing on the other side of the gate. I want to be the guy that survives. But David didn't watch any of those movies, and David knew that God was with him. So he goes and strikes, he smacks, and that's what I picture. David just walks up, smacks that bear, smacks that lion back of the head, and he grabs the sheep, ripping the jars open. And then, you got to think, like, was David just silly? Was he stupid? Was he just one of those kids that's a little brain dead? Because I wouldn't smack a bear. I wouldn't smack a lion. It says, when it turned on me, because that's what the consequences were of him hitting it and taking the sheep. It says, when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair. Now, if I had hair, I'd show you what he meant, but I don't have any hair. But can you imagine grabbing the back? My dad taught me when I was little not to mess with dogs and don't grab them by the back of the hair in the back of their neck. Right? If your dad didn't teach you that, you shouldn't do that. They might bite you. This isn't a dog. This is a lion. This is a bear. He grabs it by its hair. He smacks it again. And I'm thinking, like, why did you have to smack it? Are you trying to make it more upset? You took its food, you smacked it once, and now you grabbed it by its hair and you smack it again, and then you're going to kill it. I think I would have had the killing part in the beginning. That's how I would have started the whole conversation. I killed it first. Then I decided I'd kick it or whatever. But he does that. And David tells this part, and in fact, we go on to verse 36, it says, your servant has killed both. That's great. The lion and the bear. Then he keeps going. He says, this uncircumcised Philistine. He's making a point here. This uncircumcised Philistine, remember that means this non-part of God's covenant people. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. Smack him in the head. I'm going to smack him. I'm going to kill him. I'm going to grab his hair. I'm going to do all those things. Because I'm the man. All right, that's what he says, isn't it? No, he says because he defied the armies of the living God. We've read that before. As he asked that question earlier, and what I want you to understand here is when we get to this point with David talking to Saul, David's shifting his perspective. And what we have to realize, the key to understanding those 3 verses that I just read you, if you just read those verses and we stop there, we think, this kid has been smoking some wacky weed. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's crazy out of his mind. Is there a hunter in here that would be honest enough to admit that he would go out and smack a bear, smack a lion, and try to, and not with a gun, by the way. He's not doing it with a gun. Spear at the best. Probably did not. That's just plain insane. Unless you got God on your side. That's his point. And in order to understand what he's making, the point he's making here to Saul, he's not just telling a history lesson. You have to go to verse 37. And verse 37 is the interpretation of the first 3 verses. He said, the Lord. The Lord who rescues me. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue. Now notice he uses 2 tenses. For all you grammar students, he starts out with the past tense. The Lord who did rescue me yesterday will rescue me today. Present, future, past. And what he's saying here is, hey, you know what? God is so good that, you know what? I am not scared. And it's not because I'm the man. It's because God's the man. See, David didn't look up and say, hey, Saul, I'm a lot tougher than I look. That's not what he said. He didn't say, hey, Saul, you probably just don't know who I am. Let me tell you my credentials. And that was what the story was all about. No, what he's saying here is, God rescued me from desperate circumstances of lions and bears. And you know what? Because he did it in the past, he'll do it in the future. Amen. Hey, if that doesn't make you feel a little bit more relieved about your life right now, it should. And if it does, it's because you don't really believe your beliefs. That's just the bottom line of it. See, tomorrow isn't scary to me. The election in the fall isn't scary to me. You know why? Not because I've got a candidate that's better than anybody else, because I don't. It's not because I have all the economy figured out and I know what the future is. Hey, health issues, all those things, none of those things scare me. You know why? Because I believe that God is in control. Amen. And that's why I don't have to worry. Because God took care of me before. And I have to remind myself, and that's the great point what David's doing here. See, David is helping us understand what David knew. Verse 36, David says, the reason I know we're going to win is because he defied not me, not you, not the army of Saul, but the army of the living God. He's in big trouble, man. You can mess with a lot of guys, but you can't mess with God, is what David is saying here. And Saul didn't have that perspective. And that's the difference about what he's trying to get to. See, we've got to realize that God is concerned for his name, for his glory, for his people, and the unfolding of his eternal purpose. And ultimately, what's happening here has to do with a far larger perspective than simply the defeat of the Philistine, or even the Philistine army against the armies of Israel. See, what's happening here is God's plan. And God's plan is this: God's people, in God's place, under God's rule, experiencing God. That was his plan. And that's why Saul was such a bad king, because he didn't want that. He didn't even see that. And David becomes this man after God's own heart, because this is exactly what David understood. We talked about this is the same deal about Joseph. We talked about him in our Sunday school class. Joseph had that perspective too. That, hey, he might have been number 2 in all the greatest power in all the world, but if you read through what Joseph says, he understands that he really wasn't the power, it was God. Greater power. And that's why he said God will take us back to our land. God will keep us where we need to be. See, God's people in God's place, under God's rule, experiencing God. We would call it heaven. But it doesn't have to be heaven. It could be right now. Because God wants to do that not in the future, but right now for us. And the reason the Israelites don't experience it is because they have the wrong perspective about who God was. See, David's saying, I believe that God, who has shown himself strong in the past, will show himself strong in the present. And he was willing to stake his life on it, because when you ask David the question, do you believe your beliefs? David says absolutely. That's why a little shepherd boy can walk out with a rock and a sling. and walk up to a threatening 9'9" giant, fully clothed in armor, who has a shield bearer in front of him, who has all kinds of weapons, who has been trained all his life, yelling and cursing at him and threatening him. And David can walk out confidently and say, you know what? That's good, but today God's going to kill you. And today the birds of the air are going to eat your flesh. And that's not because David had bravado. It's not even because David had training or the answer to anything. See, David doesn't go off on some great statement of my heroism. He says, I remember God. And what David does is he combines a good memory with sound thinking. Because God did that there and then, he'll do this here and now. That's what David's saying. Proverbs chapter 3. I'm pretty sure you've probably done these verses before, but what's interesting, the author of Proverbs says this. And by the way, the author of Proverbs is the son of David. I'm sure that David taught him this lesson. He says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And that was the problem. That's been the whole problem. The difference between David and the Israelites, the difference between David and Eliab, the difference between David and Saul was looking at a human level saying, I am a troubleshooter. I know how to figure things out. This is how I'm going to do. And David says, I don't have to. I don't have to be great. I don't have to be great at anything. I've got a God who's greater than anything. Amen. And that's what the author says here. And he goes on to say in verse 6, in all your ways, submit to him. And you know what he's saying here? He's saying, if someone asks you, does your beliefs do you believe your beliefs? Then you should say, absolutely, because all my ways match up to what I believe. In all your ways, not Sunday morning ways, but Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Not when I'm in big trouble ways. He's saying, when you face giants, but when you face the ordinary, in all your ways, submit to him. Not when I feel like it, not when it's okay, not when I'm not on the job, because the job requires me to do my own thing. No, he's saying in all your ways, submit to him. And the problem with the Israelites, the problem with Eliab, the problem with Saul is, hey, you know what? They didn't even think about God. They were still the army of Israel. And David saw them as the armies of the living God. In all your ways, submit to him. He'll make you pass straight. See, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 makes it very clear that we don't rely on our own insight. That's what too many of us are doing. It's not our own insight. It doesn't say here in these verses, by the way, it doesn't say not to use insight. It says, don't rely on your perspective. What he wants us to understand, and this is the bottom line here, he's telling us, bring your insights and analysis under the supreme rule of who God is. And that's what made David a Goliath killer. The perspective he had. The stone couldn't miss. The stone can't miss. It's big enough. It's going to take out a giant. And you know what? He was okay. It's the same perspective that Daniel had in the lion's den. It's the same perspective that remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? King calls them up and says, guys, in case you didn't hear, because I heard you didn't bow down to my image when the music played. In case you didn't hear, I'm going to give you a second chance. And before he even gets that sentence out, you know what they say? Don't worry, King, we heard the rules, but we're just not following them. To which the king got really upset. Because they said, hey, you know what, King? Even if Goliath beats us, we're still following God. It's okay because our perspective is far greater than yours. And you think the fiery furnace is going to take us out. It's not. It doesn't have a chance against us, and that's the issue there. See, I would tell you today, if you're not a Christian, you're listening, you're online or here, Christianity isn't a mindless faith. It isn't. See, David shows us this. It's not a mindless faith. And what you have to understand is you don't go out to face the giants because you're thinking you're the right stuff. You don't serve God because you've got the right tools. You're the person who's got it all figured out. You've got it under. No, not at all. David's the example there. What you're supposed to do is bring your memory to bear. Remember all the times that God helped you. And when we don't remember who God is, we start doubting that God can work with us, through us, for us. And that's the problem. And thus we cry, I can't do this. And God's saying, yes, you can, because you don't have to do it. I'll do it for you. But when you rely on you, you will fail. You won't even attempt it. And that's the difference in perspective. Perspective, that's all the difference we need. The foe is still the same foe when David steps out in the field. The circumstances are still the same circumstances. The challenge is still the same challenge. And it's not because David was special. It's not. If anything, I want you to come away from this saying David was less than special. See, it's not all about me. It's not all about you. It's all about God. And that's the great news. The soldiers standing there that day thought it's all about us. And we can't do this. It's all about God. And David knew that. And if you don't realize that about God, if you don't realize it's all about God, you know what's going to happen? You're going to be standing there doing nothing for another 40 years.